Chapter 374 was a cornucopia of progression and regression. Progression in that a lot of things happen in this chapter that are going to move the story forward. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the mental and emotional states of the protagonist of this story. Ever since Griffith punked him and stole his girl at Elfhelm, Guts has been a husk of his former self. Every time we see him, we end up worrying even more about him, which we didn't think would be possible after the Lost Children arc. Guts made a lot of progress as a character, reining in his bloodlust and killing instinct to protect his newfound friends and preserve the love of his life. But now that the latter is gone, he's regressing back to the days when he used to be all by himself. And trust us when we say that's not a good sign for anyone that was involved in Chapter 374. The latest installment of Berserk ended with Guts in chains and the Seahorse crew arriving in a strange new world. So, what do you think's going to happen in the next one? Well, we know what we think is going to happen, and we're going to share that with you in this video. So, without further ado, these are our predictions for Berserk Chapter 375. Crippling fear, grappling hooks, and a black beast in chains. A brief recap of Chapter 374. If you're new to our channel, we recommend that you go watch our analysis video on Chapter 374 before continuing on with this one, because a lot of things will make more sense after that. We'll still give you a short recap to get things going here, because there are a lot of hints as to the immediate future of Berserk within this chapter. Titled, Is the Sleeping Black Beast But Biding Its Time? Chapter 374 marks the beginning of the Eastern Exile arc. Looks like it's going to be the penultimate arc of Berserk. You'll understand why by the time this video ends, so let's get on with the recap. The chapter opens with the Kushan perspective on the boarding of the Seahorse, which the previous chapter ended with, and we learn that there are far more ships out to get Guts and co than we thought possible. A total of 12 Kushan war galleys shot scorpions with grappling hooks into all sides of the Seahorse, bringing the vessel to a complete halt. The Kushan slavers entered the vessel in droves, taking over each level of the massive man-o-war meticulously. By the time Serpico and Isidro, who were hanging out on the top deck, realized what was happening, it was too late. Despite fending off a couple of Kushan slavers with their death stare and dropkick respectively, Serpico and Isidro realized that the stateroom in which Shirkei's ritual was taking place had already been swarmed by the slavers. The same was true for every other cabin in the Seahorse, including the one where Guts was currently regurgitating despair. There's a quick comedic bit with Azan where he thinks he's being punished for stealing supplies, and when he realizes these guys are Kushan, changes the topic to divine retribution instead. But he's the one guy who actually foreshadows the immediate future of the franchise. As the Kushans prepare to check out the room Azan and his mates were hanging outside of, Azan himself realizes that that's where Guts has been kept. He knows Guts' current mental state, and Azan has seen him go berserk under the influence of the Berserker armor many a time. He forgets all about his own transgressions against the holy vow of knighthood, and starts to fear for the lives of the Kushan men who were about to poke the vulnerable Black Swordsman. The Kushan dudes enter Guts' cabin, and after making sure he isn't moving around or gripping his massive sword, they try to chain him. When Guts wakes up briefly to see what was happening and reaches out for his sword before falling back on the floorboards, the Kushans become terrified of him, as if they know who he is and what he can do. But then again, they did bring chains to tie him up, so that should have been clear from the start. On the top deck, we see Roderick pleading with his captors to let the women and children go unmolested while he tries to figure out their identity. Magnifico, meanwhile, is acting his usual dignified self and crapping his pants all over the place out of sheer terror. Considering the fact that Ys, Roderick's homeland, is an island located far off the northern coast of the mainland, it isn't surprising he doesn't know what the Kushan look like. The only reason he was in Vertanis in the first place was because of his proposed betrothal to Farnace, and when the Kushans attacked that holy city, they didn't exactly do it with their army, at least when Roderick was around for it. Ganishka sent in his Pishacha and Daka before he sent in his human forces, and by that time our crew was far off into the high seas. But as soon as Roderick realizes that these guys are Kushan, he becomes confused because despite never having seen a Kushan, he knows of their malign reputation. And Roderick struggles to understand why such a merciless savage would not kill off even a single person on a ship they're clearly trying to board and capture, when that is exactly what they would have done under Ganishka. He thinks there must be some other reason for them being still allowed to breathe, and turns out he's right. There are two reasons why everyone aboard the Seahorse is still alive, and they are, number one, the Kushan warriors here belong to the Baki Raka clan, and are under the service of the much more reasonable Silat, who also shows up towards the end of the chapter. And number 2, they were primarily here for Guts. The Kushan warriors in Guts' cabin brought chains with them because they clearly knew of him. The real question is how and why, and what happens to those guys. To answer the third one, it looks like none of them survived, because one of the final panels of chapter 374 shows Guts walking out of his cabin, and our analysis video explains just what that means for the immediate future of the series. But the real cliffhanger is the surprise return of Power Slap champion of the Berserkverse, Rickert. The final panels of chapter 374 show multiple Kushan warriors struggling to pull whatever is at the end of their chains, presumably Guts, and Rickert looking confused at the required effort initially, then shocked at what was causing it in the end. The last time we saw Rickert, he became the only man in the known world to build a rocket launcher, a fire extinguisher, and, actually land a physical blow on Griffith. The God Hand likes to talk about causality and its convergence every time they appear, and now it looks like that stream is changing its direction because for once, all the good guys are converging at a single location. But there are questions that need answering, so we'll get to that in the next few sections. How did the Bakiraka clan know where to find Guts? How is it related to why they're going east? The operation to immobilize the Seahorse looks like it was planned down to the last detail, which is surprising considering no one really knew where it was going when it left Vratanus, and especially not after it left Elfhelm. More than that, the Bakiraka clan didn't just chance upon them in the high seas. They came after them with tools especially designed for naval warfare. They had more than a dozen galleys, they had what looks like hundreds of men with them, and not to mention their young master, his Tapasa, and their new visitor all tagged along for what clearly is some kind of prophetic mission. Because consider this. Why did the Bakiraka raiders that entered Guts' cabin become so scared of him once they saw his Dragon Slayer? If you read the chapter carefully, that whole scene plays out like a monster movie, with one guy being sent out to the front to do all the heavy lifting, while all his friends stand in the background and wait to see what happens. It makes sense that they would be familiar with the Dragon Slayer given that Silat and Rickert are with them, because both of them know Guts' weapon loadout intimately, but it doesn't explain their fear. Silat and Rickert don't think of Guts as an enemy. Rickert thinks of Guts as a friend, and while Silat and Guts have had their differences, their goals pretty much ended up aligning towards the end of the Conviction arc, and both of them have a healthy respect for each other's fighting skills. The reason why we think Rickert looks so surprised at the end of the chapter is the same reason we think those guys in Guts' cabin were terrified of kicking his sword out of his hand. Because they don't exactly know that it's him. If you guys recall what happened during Rickert's great escape from Falconia, he left that city in the company of Silat, his Tapasa, Erika, and Emperor Ganishka's former wizard general, Daiba. Daiba is a man whose knowledge of the astral world places him at the same level as a great guru in our opinion. His taming of the Kundalini alone is proof of that. Daiba knows of the real nature of apostles, has used them to create a man-made Behelit, Daka monsters, as well as an entire army of demonic animals that steamrolled its way through the main continent of the Berserkverse. He's even familiar with the Berserker armor and the Sylph cloak and sword, only he uses the nomenclature of his homeland to address their wearers. And this is a key thing to recall with regards to why this arc is called Eastern Exile. It's not a stretch of the imagination to think that Daiba can also look into the future or receive prophetic visions, because it appears as though their capturing of Guts is driven by one of those two things. The title of this chapter doesn't talk about Guts in the context of the Black Swordsman. It specifically refers to him as a Black Beast, and considering the fact that the last chapter had his inner beast of darkness urging him to give himself over to it, we have to imagine it's the beast Daiba saw in his visions and not Guts himself. This actually wouldn't be inconsistent with how Guts is seen within Berserk's dreamscape, because if you recall the Quarter of Dreams chapters, Guts was represented as a hound that closely resembled the Beast of Darkness once it got its Berserker armor on. Also, when Guts had acclimated with the armor, its visor turned into the shape of the beast itself, which seems to imply that Guts' ethereal body can be perceived as the Beast of Darkness. This would make even more sense if Daiba was the one who was looking for him given his inclination for the dark arts, but we're getting too deep here. The point is, when Griffith claimed that his army needed to head east at the end of chapter 372, we didn't understand why. It's safe to say that now we're getting the picture. The Baki-Raka clan must have received some kind of oracle from Daiba regarding a berserker beast that could assist them in their quest to defeat Griffith, which is how they coordinated this capture so perfectly. It's also why they haven't killed anyone yet, because they're most likely going to end up heading towards the clan's hidden mountain lairs, which we all know lies to the east of Midland, hence Eastern Exile. It's possible we might just have also predicted why Griffith would want to head east, because if Guts is there, and Daiba is there, and Rickert is there, and Silat has an army that can actually do some damage to his war demons, then they're now his biggest problem after the Giants and the Hydra. It'll be interesting to see what BS reason he comes up with to justify attacking other humans to his Falconians, but what's even more interesting to us in the short term is how Silat and Rickert and the rest will react and respond in the next chapter, considering what we're going to predict next. Guts will go berserk, and it will probably take more than chains to calm him down. Ever since Griffith stole Casca and broke Elfhelm, he has been living rent-free in Guts' head, and not in the way he usually does. See, usually, Griffith is a motivator of the most toxic order for Guts. Hate for him is what fuels his life, maybe less so after he found friends again, but it still does. However, now that is coupled with his helplessness after he realized he can't touch Griffith, and every chapter since then has felt like an agonizing ticking time bomb. Chapter 373 made it clear to us that he was weak enough to actually consider giving into his malice once again, and it looks like he has in chapter 374. We don't actually see Guts kill anyone. It's implied when he walks out of the room, his greaves looking like the feet of doom itself, but there's another indication which is something both overt and subtle at the same time. If you guys pay attention to the moment the Baki-Raka boys break out the chains to bind up Guts, you'll notice the first panel involving chains actually shows them being smashed by something akin to a black whirlwind in the background. Immediately after this, though, the chains take hold, and for the rest of the chapter, we see dozens of Kushan men tugging on it with all their might. It's possible that the first set of chains they used on Guts broke, so they just went again? Sure, but we think it's something else. If you go back to chapter 373 and look at the moment where the Beast of Darkness manifests from the Dragon Slayer, you'll notice that it's sitting on the blade surrounded by shattered chains. This is an extremely important metaphorical representation of the fact that Guts has consciously decided to let go of restraint and return to his animalistic state from the Black Swordsman arc. Chains, in relation to the Beast of Darkness, have always represented Guts holding back his own malice from taking over his will to protect his loved ones. After going berserk unintentionally a couple of times, Guts decided to chain up the Beast of Darkness so he wouldn't constantly be putting his friends' lives in danger because he was using the berserker armor. But after being shown his squirming sacrificial place on the pecking order of existence, it looks like Guts unconsciously decided to snap the chains holding him back in chapter 373. Chapter 374 was just him making that a reality. The chains that snapped before the chains that went onto him are representative of him unleashing the Beast of Darkness in its full power, and that means that no one aboard any of the dozen-plus ships in the vicinity is safe anymore. Guts is going to go berserk without a shadow of a doubt, but the question is, who's going to stop him? Or rather, can anyone stop him at all? Usually it takes the Moonlight Boy to definitively put an end to his rampages, unless Shirke goes along with him astrally beforehand. Even then, there's the possibility of her getting knocked out of their link, and if that happens, re-entering it is practically impossible for her given the armor's aversion to her ode. There are quite a few mages aboard the Seahorse, but as they point out to Magnifico, their staves were taken away by the Kushan, so their magic is as good as useless at the moment. The only person who can perform staffless magic beside the regular mages are the Great Elders and probably Farnace, and while it's nice and all that Farney is a prodigious mage and what have you, we don't think she can quite bring Guts back to the realm of reason without getting a lot of help. Also, those chains need to be even better than Hanar's, because he's the creator of the Berserker armor, and Guts snapped through his restraints. But we think the chains used in the chapter were made by Rickert, so we would at least put good money on them holding up longer than you'd expect them to, which is a second or so, maybe. Perhaps this is where Silat finally gets a win against Guts, which isn't entirely implausible given that he has improved so much he can now keep up with formless black robes that fight dirty and use needles as blades. Whatever the case, it's clear that Guts will go on a short tear and then be put down using methods that are perhaps rougher than what he's used to given his natural mental state is fully in sync with the Berserker armor's influence right now, and breaking that kind of connection is extremely difficult. After that, he, along with everyone else, will be brought back to the Bakiraka Fortress, where they will plan their final move against Griffith. Or Guts will kill everyone present, grab a sea dragon, and bleed out on his way to Falconia as he kills literally everything he can lay his eyes upon. That's if Griffith doesn't find him, so, a day at best. Either way, it's clear that this eastern exile to the Bakiraka clan's hidden lair is going to be the penultimate stage of the Berserk story, because given the natural progression of things, it only makes sense that this arc be pure setup for the major final battle. All the good guys with the goods to do anything about the Griffith problem and the goods to go through with their convictions will be gathered in one place now, which consolidates their strength, but also makes them sitting ducks for a war demon attack. The plan they will come up with is what we can't predict right now, because we don't have enough variables in our head. But we're sure that as this arc plays out, we'll find out more about that. Chapter 375 is going to be a bloodbath, however, so you might want to bring an umbrella to that reading. Marvelous verdict! But as for this video, that's all we have for you guys. The Eastern Exile arc, or as so many fans are calling it, Boat Arc 2.0, is going to be the penultimate Berserk arc, at least in our opinion. So far, everything has been flowing according to Griffith's will because of his current existence, but it looks like that's set to change. However, it just wouldn't be Berserk if the main character didn't have to go through literal and metaphorical hell to get to where he wants to be. And believe us when we say this arc is going to show us the greatest struggle of Guts' life. Before Elfhelm, he had lived his life with conviction. Conviction in his strength, conviction in himself, and conviction in his sword. He has none of that now, and he needs to be a team player if he really wants to have a shot at decisively defeating Griffith, which will be hard if he's constantly going berserk around folks. And yet, struggling is what the struggler excels at doing. We're just here to enjoy that show. That's all for this video, but what did you guys think about our predictions for Chapter 375? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.